think it's time for another dose of dark history. Did you know during World War II, the Japanese instilled a death over surrender attitude in their troops? This also made its way into civilian life, because the word at the time from all of the Japanese government and media to the Japanese people was, if you are caught by US soldiers, you will be mutilated and killed and have horrible atrocities done to you. In the words of a Japanese quote, they were worried about American devils raping and devouring Japanese women and children, and this led to some extremely dark history. Did you know in the Battle of Saipan in 1944, the American soldiers recalled witnessing a banzai attack in which 4,000 Japanese troops surprise attacked the Americans and all willingly fought to the death? These were on the orders of Lieutenant General Yoshisugu, who said their actions were to honor the emperor. He then went on to commit ritual suicide by quite literally falling on his own sword. And then things got a lot worse. Realizing defeat and capture was imminent, hundreds if not thousands of Japanese soldiers and civilians began to hurl themselves off Banzai Cliff and Lateran Banadero, which is now known as Suicide Cliff. They were hurling themselves to their death into the ocean and onto the rocks below. One horrifying American soldier's account recalls seeing women grabbing children and hurling themselves from the cliff just to avoid submitting to capture. Jesus Christ! It's like the most horrific game of lemmings ever! Sorry, no, Jesus.
Platinum Blonde originates from 1930s movie starlet and sex symbol Jean Harlow. Director Howard Hughes organized a publicity campaign offering $10,000 to any beautician who could match what would quickly become Harlow's signature platinum shade. Many fans and their beauticians attempted to no avail and instead only to find dire consequences. The color was reportedly achieved with the weekly application of ammonia, Clorox bleach, and Lux soap flakes. These caustic chemicals combined caused severe hair damage, even some reporting permanent hair loss. The prize went unclaimed, but the publicity scheme worked, and the Platinum Blonde nickname stuck with Harlow. The process weakened and damaged Harlow's hair, eventually to the point where she had to wear a wig. Some speculate the numerous hazardous weekly treatments over time may have attributed to her early tragic death. On June 6, 1937, Jean Harlow died at 26 years old from compounded health complications.
On today's episode of Strange History, we are talking about leeches and labias. Yes, you heard that right. During the medieval era, women were expected to be virgins on their wedding night, so if they weren't, there was little tips and tricks that they could do. To fake this virgin test, you were instructed on the day before your wedding to cautiously, and I quote cautiously, put a leech on your labia. Since once you removed the leech, a small area would crust over with blood, and then on your wedding night, during your intimate time, that scab would then fall off and you would bleed. Could you imagine asking help from a friend and just being like, "Good day, would I put thy leech on my labia?" No, I don't want to do that, no.
Strange History Part 7, Aztec Human Sacrifice. When Spanish conquistadors first arrived in the Americas in the 15th century, they soon found the highly developed and sophisticated Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan. They reported witnessing ritual human sacrifice and towers made of human skulls. Until recently, historians thought that was an exaggeration, but now we know these towers were real and part of the human sacrifice. These structures were called Zompantli, and archaeologists have uncovered a structure with an estimated 60,000 skulls. After the heart was removed with a razor-sharp obsidian blade, they would remove your skull with expert knowledge of human anatomy, carve a hole in the side, and create a stacked structure of skulls, as well as towers made of mortar. Human sacrifice was an integral part of Aztec religion. It wasn't so much a punishment as an offering to the gods, and was believed to lead to an honored afterlife.
Disturbing history facts that they don't teach in school. Human zoos were active until 1958. They had people from various regions in cages. The My Lai massacre in Vietnam. The US Marines marched into a village and killed over 600 people. Even the babies were shot. The pirates were the terrorists of their time. Killing, burning, execution games, slavery, and even cannibalism. So they had nothing to do with the pirates in the movies.
Historical facts that'll creep you out, part 4. A woman in the 7th century gave birth after she had already died, and her case isn't unique. Archaeologists discovered the mother's remains lying face up, suggesting a deliberate burial. But what they weren't expecting to find was the remains of a baby between her, with only the legs of the baby still inside of her. There have been other instances of this happening throughout history as well, and there's actually a term for it: coffin birth. And it happens when a pregnant corpse releases enough gases while decomposing that it pushes the stillborn fetus out of the womb. used to cover their mirrors after someone died.
True.
Back in the Victorian era, after someone died, they would immediately go to their house and cover their mirrors with black cloths.
This is because they believed that if they walked past the mirror and saw their deceased loved one looking back at them, it meant they would die
Hence the
next.
term black
They also thought the
mirror
spirit would be forever trapped inside the
when
mirror
people
and
look
would
through a
never
black
be able
mirror.
to find peace.
And they see
There were also
spirits.
just a lot of superstitions around mirrors back in that time.
Yeah.
People thought that spirits could come through them. People thought mirrors brought bad luck.
Black
People thought that
mirrors.
if you looked at
Literally
yourself in
black
the
mirrors.
mirror, you
Yeah.
would find the secret truth about yourself. But yeah,
Or
there are
demons.
a lot of very creepy vintage photos of people covering their mirrors with
Good
black
video.
blankets
Yeah.
or cloths.
Meet Britain's first known female serial killer, Marianne Cotton. A Victorian housewife, she was known for poisoning her victims with arsenic. Born in 1832 in County Durham, she was thought to have murdered up to 21 people, including 11 of her own children. However, she was only convicted for the murder of her stepson, Charles Edward Cotton. She would fill her teapot with arsenic and poison her victims over time. Each time a husband died, she would pick up a hefty insurance claim. Arsenic is tasteless, and so it was difficult to accuse her of anything without proof, especially since the effects of the poison, vomiting, diarrhea, and abdominal pain, were common in Victorian times and indicative of other illnesses. Since working class people were often sick and died of malnutrition, the deaths were largely unchallenged. She was tried and convicted of murdering her stepson Charles Edward Cotton on the 7th of March 1873.
Post-mortem photography became common in Victorian England when the rise of early photography coincided with the short lifespans of individuals. This is when they took portraits with the already deceased. As photography was still rare, the death of a family member was often the first time a family considered taking a portrait. They did this to commemorate the dead and to have an image of the deceased.
This is the dark and twisted origin of the treadmill. In 1818, Sir William Cubitt designed a cruel and unusual punishment for English prisoners. Treadmill, also known as the everlasting staircase, was a giant wheel connected to metal spokes. As the prisoners kept climbing, the gears would turn, helping to pump water, crush grain, and power mills, hence treadmill. Prisoners would be forced to do this for 6 hours a day, climbing 14,000 feet, the equivalent of halfway up Everest. Imagine doing that every day. After being banned as a form of punishment in the end of the 19th century, it made a comeback in 1913 when the first patent was filed for an exercise treadmill. Nowadays, it's a torture device you can willingly subject yourself to.
This is Marianne Cotton. When she was 20, she married William Mowbray and they had 5 kids. However, 4 of them died of gastric fever. They then had 3 more kids who also died. Then her husband also died, so she's seeming like a pretty unlucky woman. She then remarried to George Ward a year later, but he also died. You'd think they would be getting a little suspicious by now, but oh no. She then got married to James Robinson, who did not die. But 2 of her own daughters, her own mother, and 2 of James's kids did. She then bigamously married her 4th husband, Frederick, who died, along with their own child, Frederick's sister, and Frederick's other child. Then the person who she was having an affair with died. They only began to get a tiny bit suspicious when Frederick's own child died. They examined his body and found traces of arsenic, which is how she killed all of her other victims. She was arrested and hung on March 24th, 1873.
This painting was painted using dead people.
In the 16th and 17th centuries, people began disrespectfully digging up the remains of ancient Egyptian mummies. Using the ground up remains, they were able to make a pigment which would be used for painting. This color would become known as mummy brown, considering it did contain human remains. The color had a tendency to crack once painted, however, as it was made up of fat. Martin Drolling's 1815 painting, Interior of a Kitchen, uses mummy brown extensively. Sometimes the demand heavily outnumbered the supply of actual mummies, and sellers had to use the corpses of slaves or criminals. I mean, these were coming from the same people who were having mummy unwrapping parties, so I don't think they were too worried about disrespecting the corpse. In the early 1900s, demand for the shade almost completely dropped as people were starting to somewhat come to their senses. Today, a modern pigment exists sans actual mummy.
One of the dumbest ways people have ever died. Part 1. At a sauna party in Moscow, dry ice was thrown into an indoor swimming pool to create a thick layer of fog. This resulted in 3 people dying of carbon dioxide suffocation. The steam is cool, but it ain't worth it. My man Edmund Ironside, the King of England in 1016, was stabbed to death while sitting on a toilet by an assassin hiding out underneath. That man was committed. King Frederick of Sweden once consumed a meal of lobster, caviar, sauerkraut, smoked herring, champagne, topped off with 14 cinnamon buns. He became known as the king who ate himself to death. A Toronto lawyer was demonstrating how a building's windows were absolutely unbreakable. So he tested it out, throwing himself up against the window, and fell to his death. Jimmy Heselden, the owner of Segway, died after riding his Segway off a cliff. Should have installed a better GPS, my man.
Here's some of the most brutal torture methods in history. Part 3. In the early modern period, a new torture device called the head crusher was introduced, and it is exactly what it sounds like. The device consisted of a metal cap that would go on the victim's head and a metal bar that would rest below the jaw. The torturer would then slowly twist the handle, which forced the cap down and, like the name implies, crushed their skull. If the torturer wanted to increase the pain, they would even hit the cap with a metal pipe. This torture usually led to death, but not before the victim's skull was crushed, including their teeth, and their eyes popped out of their sockets.
Things that happened throughout history, May 24th. In 1943, Auschwitz gets a new doctor, the Angel of Death. The extermination camp in Poland receives a new doctor, Joseph Mengele, a man who will earn the nickname the Angel of Death. Upon arriving at Auschwitz, eager to advance his medical career by publishing groundbreaking works, he began experimenting on live prisoners. He injected thousands of inmates from everything from petrol to chloroform. He managed to escape imprisonment after the war and eventually fled to Brazil, where he died of a stroke. In 1964, riots erupt in Lima, Peru at a soccer match, killing hundreds. A referee's call in the soccer match between Argentina and Peru sparked a huge riot. More than 300 fans were killed and some 500 people were injured in the violence. The match was a qualifier for the Olympics, and when a referee disallowed an apparent goal, the fans went wild. The resulting panic and crowd control measures caused stampedes in which people were crushed and killed.
Today we're looking at some of the worst torture methods carried out by the Vikings. Let's get it started. At number 3, we've got the hung meat. For this method, the torturer would take a very sharp knife and cut a hole all the way through the victim's foot between the Achilles tendon and the bone. They would then take a thick rope and push it through the hole in the victim's foot. They would then be strung upside down, left to die. At number 2, we've got the fatal walk. This gruesome torture method started with the victim's abdomen being sliced open and the intestines pulled out. The torturer then held the victim's intestines as the poor soul walked around a tree. Eventually, the victim's entire intestinal tract would wrap around the tree, resulting in their death. At number 1, of course, the blood eagle. The victim's hands and legs would be tied to prevent escape. The torturer would then stab the victim through the tailbone, up through the rib cage. Each rib would be separated and pushed through the back with an axe. And then salt would be added to the wound. And lastly, the lungs would be pulled out and spread across the ribs, looking like wings.
The old burying ground was first opened in 1749, the same year Halifax was founded. It was the town's first burial ground, with a burial taking place the day after it was opened. It was used until 1844. During that period, over 12,000 men, women, and children were buried here, but only 1,200 are represented by gravestones, meaning fewer than 10% of the graves are marked. Some stones have been lost, but many others were buried without markers, especially those who were poor or who died during various epidemics. The cemetery was neglected from the time it stopped accepting bodies in 1844 until it was restored in the mid-1980s. Thomas Halliburton reportedly described it in 1835 as a nasty, dirty, horrid-looking burying ground, filled with large grave rats as big as kittens, with springs of black water that go through the chinks of the rocks and flow into all the wells and fairly poison the folks. It's a dismal place, I tell you.
The Nor Loch was a man-made lake in Edinburgh created in 1460 to serve as a defence for the town and the castle. At first, the loch was a picturesque and relaxing haven for the townspeople. However, over the years, the loch became a dump for all sorts of waste, such as human filth. All the closes on the loch side of the Royal Mile stretched down on a steep slope towards the bank of the loch. Before sanitation arrived in Edinburgh, people would throw their filth out the windows, which would flow down the closes and into the Nor Loch. Eventually, it became a stinking cesspool. It has been said that the loch was involved in the Scottish witch trials, where people accused of witchcraft would have their thumbs and toes tied together and then duked or ducked into the loch. If the accused floated, they would be found guilty and executed. If they sank and drowned, they were innocent. However, by this point, they were now dead. The loch was drained in the late 18th century to allow the construction of the North Bridge and eventually for the building of the new town. During the draining, many skeletons were found, including two said to be of George St. Clair and his sister, who were found guilty of incest in 1620 and were then placed inside a chest and thrown in the loch to drown. The site of the North Loch is now where Princes Street Gardens is.
In the late 19th century, a group of lumberjacks came down with a mysterious illness. It caused them to leap into fires, hurl knives, and brutally attack each other. No one knows what caused it or even how to treat it, and people are still contracting it, even to this day. What do you think it is? Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel.